Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Randy Persaud. With me today is Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance, Dr. Ashni Singh. Dr. Singh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Randy. It's a great pleasure to be here with you on this new series of programs that you'll be launching.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. One of the things that I'm hoping that we could focus on is to clarify a lot of the key concepts and categories that are often used in the media. But a lot of of our citizens don't understand these very complicated concepts, and so I look forward to you explaining some of this and putting them in some context. You were Minister of Finance before when we didn't have oil, and now you're a senior minister responsible for finance in the office of the president, and we have an oil economy. How do you compare them? Before without oil, and now we have a lot more resources.
Sure. So let me say it's an interesting question. In fact, it's a question that I'm often asked. I must admit, it's not the first time that I've been asked this question. I would say the following, that as the finance minister in a People's Progressive Party government, there are certain constants, there are certain elements or objectives that have remained the same over time, certain cardinal or core principles. These include, for example, our studied objective of crafting a policy matrix aimed at steady and sustainable improvement in the lives of all Guyanese. That has not changed. That has been a constant throughout successive PPP governments. And within that, a matrix of policies aimed at ensuring continued and resilient economic growth. That has not changed. That's been a constant policy objective. Ensuring fiscal sustainability and fiscal viability. And in fact, in the earlier PPP governments, the immediate post-1992 PPP government, restoring fiscal solvency and then achieving fiscal sustainability and maintaining, protecting, and consolidating it. That has not changed. Prudent, transparent, and accountable management of the fiscal resources of the state. That has not changed. And so there are a few elements that I would say are core objectives that the PPP has remained steadfastly and unapologetically faithful to. These are core things. We exist for the purpose of working towards improving the lives of our countrymen, of our fellow Guyanese brothers of our Guyanese brothers and sisters. Those core objectives have not changed. They were there when we came into government in 1992 and we were a heavily indebted poor country. They were there over time as we achieved debt sustainability and fiscal sustainability, but in the pre-oil era. And they continue to inform all that we do. They're still very much there, those core objectives, and continue to inform all that we do going forward in this oil era. So, in terms of the core objectives, we've been steadfast and unwavering. Of course, the context has changed, and so there was a time when Guyana was a heavily indebted poor country, when the fiscal situation was very different. Our standing in the global community was very
different. Is putting it mildly.
Different, of course, is putting it extremely mildly. And I can get into the details about what is and what is different now from then, if time permits us. But our fiscal situation is completely and dramatically different. Some of the policy choices and alternatives that we have before us now we did not have then. We're able to do things considerably more quickly now than we were able to do then. But having said that, with a large and rapidly growing resource economy, new challenges and threats are present and emerging, which did not exist at that time, and those have to be carefully managed as well. So I would say to you that the context has certainly changed, the setting has certainly changed, the world has changed too. And so, notwithstanding our steadfastness to our core objectives, as you would know, and I think your viewers would know, the People's Progressive Party continues to be an agile and adaptable political force, adapting to changing global realities, adapting to changing domestic circumstances and realities to ensure that we and what we do remain relevant and suitable to the circumstances of today and indeed to the circumstances of tomorrow.
And the word agile there is not simply an adjective. There is an agile world economy. The
Absolutely.
rate of change
Absolutely.
is astounding, right?
Absolutely.
Especially with digitalization and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
One of the continuity in general principles, that's one thing. But we have a continuity in framework with the low carbon development strategy, developed first around 2009, 2010, when President Jack Deo was in office. And we have the revised 2030 LCDS. So it is more than a matter of, it's more than principles and so on. It's an actual framework. There's continuity in framework, albeit it's been revised. Is that correct?
You are absolutely correct. In fact, I say to people that generations of our ancestors protected the standing forests, not for emotional reasons, not for want of alternative, but because they must have, in their minds, have formulated a thought process and arrived at a conclusion that cutting down all of the trees around them was not in their best interest.
Right.
Long before the nomenclature of climate change and the ozone layer and carbon emissions and carbon storage, long before that nomenclature had entered the global consciousness. If you look at the People's Progressive Party and our policy framework, like you said, speaking of consistency of policy framework, you will recall, and I know many of your viewers will recall, that President Jagan had articulated a vision organized around what he described as the new global human order.
Correct, yes.
And that new global human order was expounded on globally, became the subject of discussions and debates at the United Nations,
Correct.
was eventually the subject of United Nations resolution, a resolution of the General Assembly. And if you look within the new global human order, you will see that there is articulated a concept, Dr. Jagan articulated a concept that he described at the time as ecological justice.
Right.
And at the core of that concept was this principle that we face an extraordinary vulnerability to climate change as a low-lying coastal state, a state with a significant low-lying coastal plain. So we face an extraordinary vulnerability to climate change. At the same time, we're making an extraordinary contribution to the global fight against climate change by preserving the standing forests and serving, therefore, as the lungs of the earth. So that philosophical anchor was there in the new global human order, this concept of ecological justice.
And especially if you take from 1992 and right through all the PPP administrations, a focus on human development and human security have been central even within the LCDS.
Absolutely. President Jack Deo then anchored by that philosophy that is this philosophy of environmental responsibility and commitment to environmental sustainability, then translated that philosophy into the low carbon development strategy, which set out a practical basis for quantifying, for the first time, quantifying Guyana, the economic value to the world of Guyana's standing forests. And on that basis, and we got good world-class global advice in doing this, so there was actually a quantitative model that estimated the economic value to the world and the economic value to the nation of the standing forest. And so we got one of the world's leading consulting firms doing this work for us. you know, under the instruction, McKinsey.
Yeah.
So McKinsey did a study under President Jagdeu's instructions to estimate the economic value to the nation and the economic value to the world of Guyana standing forests.
And in a comparative way, because it also looked at solar, it looked at wind power,
That's
and
correct.
then
Alternative
it costed
new
it out,
absolutely,
correct? Yeah.
Absolutely. And on that basis, articulated for the first time ever the case on a rigorous scientific, not on emotional basis, not an emotional appeal to say we're doing something good and the world should embrace us and hug us for that. Not on an emotional, on a rigorous scientific basis, made the case that standing forests should be remunerated for the climate services, climate services that they provide. In other words, we are providing the most efficient means through which carbon is extracted from the atmosphere and stored by virtue of maintaining the standing forest. And that service is a valuable one and one that should be remunerated.
Previous to which, the debate whether it's to cut or how much or not cut, and what happened with the first LCDS model and then the revised version, is that it actually incorporated the forests into a macroeconomic model and was able to develop, if you will, I see it as an ideas-based value. The whole there's an idea that was developed
Absolutely.
to monetize
Absolutely.
forestry and to be able to look at it as an active resource
Absolutely.
within a macroeconomic framework. Yes.
You are absolutely correct. And you know, I would say this, Randy, that it really was, now that you look back, this work that President Jagdeo pioneered at the time really was visionary, to put it mildly. You know, it's no wonder that it led to him as the intellectual architect of this work. It's no wonder that it led to him getting the global recognition that he got.
Correct.
You know, recognizing President Jagdeo, and then through him Guyana, or his government and Guyana as a whole, as a cutting edge, at the frontier, thought leader on this question of standing forests and the role of standing forests in the fight against climate change.
I think we were both there when the champion of the earth returned.
That's correct.
At one time.
That's
So,
correct. You know, I
right.
mean, he was recognized by UNEP
Correct,
for being
correct.
champion of the earth. He was
Yeah.
recognized by Time magazine for being amongst the 100 most
Prince
influential
Charles
people.
and a number
You
of
know,
people, right?
you know, this really, when you look back at it, you know, because, I mean, like I said, what was significant was the migration from the emotional to the rigorous and practical. You know, it's one thing to make an argument on emotional basis. You know?
and sluggishness,
That's correct.
inertia.
Absolutely. And in a rigorous way to articulate on the global stage that standing forests are providing a valuable service, and that valuable service should be remunerated. And indeed to incentivize good behavior, because there was this debate also about reforestation and afforestation versus avoided deforestation.
Correct, yes.
That itself needed to be articulated.
Correct.
Why, you know, in a world where you're rewarding replanting of trees that had previously been cut down, surely you should also reward not cutting down trees in the first instance. Otherwise, you're incentivizing perverse behavior, incentivizing cutting down and replanting.
And the LCDS emerged at the propitious time, at the exact intersection when, you know, climate change really started to move out of only academic and multilateral organizations into the public policy, into, let me put it in this way, into line items in budgets.
You are absolutely correct, and I'm glad that you say that, because at the time when we were doing this work, it literally represented the moment when the attention shifted from, or the focus shifted from climate change being simply a pure science-based consideration to an issue that warranted the concern not only of scientists worried about global warming and how many millimeters the sea level will rise, but shifting it from the preoccupation of environmental scientists to economic policy makers and public policy makers, because the nexus was made between the impact of climate change on economies and on people. And, it was around that time too that the impact, say, of shifts in global temperature would have on agriculture and food production and food prices. It was around that time also that debate started to gain traction when people started to examine, well, what would happen to agriculture and food supply and nutritional outcomes if temperatures continue to rise, if lands that were previously arable were no longer arable.
And so now you could see from the idea of mitigation and so on and so forth, you could go in the budget and show
Absolutely.
how indigenous peoples in Guyana
Absolutely.
were actually being paid for their service.
Absolutely.
Straight from Norway with that bilateral deal. Am I right?
You are absolutely correct. And in fact, that was the institutional architecture upon which the LCDS rested.
Yeah.
And that institutional architecture was essentially that the proceeds from the sale of our climate services will be invested in climate-related investments, adaptation and mitigation, and in particular in the transition to a low-carbon economy. So things like investment in cleaner and more renewable energy, for example, promoting agriculture and more climate-friendly agriculture, promoting the development of the hinterland village economy. So investments that were clearly aligned with the low-carbon trajectory, the achievement of our low-carbon objectives.
Investment is the investment consumption configuration, the mix.
Absolutely.
And striking the balance.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's the ratio of consumption
absolutely.
to investment, correct?
You're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
So we have used the term macroeconomic, and I wonder if you could take a moment to talk a little bit more for the benefit of our audience that are not familiar with these technical terms. Macroeconomic often, involves monetary and fiscal policies.
Sure.
So, what's monetary policy? What's fiscal policy? How does it affect the general public?
Sure.
And how do these two fit into a macroeconomic framework?
I'm glad that you asked that question, because often these terms are used and
Correct.
they're used almost as if they're universally understood. As most students of economics would know, and I believe now, there's a lot of public understanding and awareness of these issues. Economics typically comprises, the study of microeconomics and of macroeconomics. And when one speaks of microeconomics, one is speaking about essentially the economic behavior of individual economic agents, individuals, and the choices that they make, etc.
How persons behave in a marketplace.
That's correct. When one speaks of the macroeconomy or of macroeconomics, one is speaking about economies, typically national economies, on the whole, at the aggregate.
Yeah.
So aggregate production, aggregate output, aggregate value-added output, national income, savings, investment at the aggregate level.
Yeah.
So macroeconomics or the macroeconomy refers to the economy as a whole, typically at a national level. Within the policy instruments that are available to, or the categories or groups of policy instruments that are available to economic policy makers, one typically hears of fiscal policy and of monetary policy. When we speak of fiscal policy, we're typically speaking about, to put it simply, we're speaking about what I would call fiscal policy choices that may be made. Essentially, we're speaking about taxation and expenditure policies implemented by the government to achieve the government's economic policy objectives. So those policy objectives are typically the stimulation of economic growth or the maintenance of economic growth, the improvement of well-being in the population, through essentially taxation and expenditure related instruments. So adjusting taxation, tax policy, adjusting expenditure and expenditure policy. Monetary policy, on the other hand, refers to the use of monetary policy instruments to influence the money supply with the same objective of influencing ultimately economic outcomes. So here you're speaking about things like interest rates, reserve requirements, etc., which can be deployed and are deployed typically by central banks or monetary authorities to influence the money supply. Again, with the same objective, the same policy objective, typically the maintenance of low inflation or management of prices, exchange rate stability, etc. And these policies, monetary and fiscal, together are deployed in pursuit of the stated and adopted economic objectives of the countries. In our case, we're pursuing economic growth, but we're pursuing economic growth in a people-centered way. Economic growth that sees the people of Guyana benefiting and their circumstances improving.
Are at the center
the people
of these macroeconomic policies.
Absolutely, and the phrase I used was people-centered. And the People's Progressive Party has always had a people-centered approach to policy making.
The IMF, not necessarily known through history for taking a humanocentric approach to economics, nonetheless, in this recent Article 4 consultation with Guyana, seems to be very impressed with our macroeconomic policy, and it specifically said in one part of the statement that it released that it fully supports the way in which monetary policy is well focused and trained on expansionary fiscal policies. You recall, no doubt,
Absolutely,
that.
absolutely.
Could you comment on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me say in general, you are right that we just completed the Article 4 consultation. The IMF mission was here, I think, just about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And you are absolutely correct that they issued a press release that did, I would say on the whole, did reflect positively on the government's management of the economy. I think on the whole, the commentary was very positive. Having said that, of course, the report quite appropriately identified some of the risks that exist, as we have been doing as a government too, because one would be naive and indeed reckless not to identify risks that remain and that need to be monitored and that need to be managed. And the report did that.
But before we get to the risk, what are you most pleased about? What is President Ali, Vice President Jagdeo, Prime Minister Phillips, the administration?
Right.
What are you most pleased about with this review?
All right. So I would say that we are happy that we got what we believe is an objective assessment, a good, based on the report of the press, based on the press release that was issued. I would say that we consider it to be a good, solid, balanced, and objective assessment of the state of the economy right now. And we're happy to get that balanced and objective coming from an independent source. And we're happy to get that balanced and independent assessment. You correctly pointed out too that the press release, the concluding statement issued by the mission, drew attention to the appropriateness of our fiscal and monetary policy stance. Now, I want to emphasize here that that's not just, on the surface it might look like a casual statement.
That's what Ranjitan seems to think.
Right, that it's just a casual statement being made. We are operating in a particular global context. Guyana is not an isolated hermit in the global economic space. We are a fully integrated part of the global economic system. We're a small, open economy, like so many others around the world. We are affected by what happens around the world. And we have certainly not been immune. We are not immune and we're not insulated from global economic realities and global economic developments. And the world economy has been going through a tumultuous period. If you start from COVID-19 and what COVID-19 did in terms of disruption of production chains and supply chains, the world is still to recover fully
Correct.
from the fallout of COVID-19. We may have the major impact of the pandemic, the public health dimensions of the pandemic. Perhaps we may have that under control. I believe we do have it under control as a global community and even in Guyana. But the economic fallout of COVID-19 has not gone away. The fact that production chains have been disrupted, supply chains have been disrupted, the world has not seen a return to pre-COVID normalcy.
Right.
You still have the ongoing reality of the war in Ukraine. And what that has done also to commodity prices. We saw what that did to prices like fuel and wheat and so on. And also to supply chain and shipping issues, particularly shipping from that part of the world. And then of course you have the global policy response around the world. Countries, both fiscal authorities and central banks, have been responding to global inflationary pressures, including by, to come back to those monetary policy instruments that we spoke of earlier, including by raising interest rates, which has made it more costly for financing to be mobilized, both for governments and for private investors.
And especially for hydrocarbon.
And for hydrocarbons, it's become near to impossible.
But we managed to get, the president said in New York, we managed to get fixed interest rates. I mean,
Absolutely.
That's an astounding achievement. Could you explain
Absolutely.
difference between, if we didn't get these and we had floating rates, what are the risks involved in that?
Absolutely. And, in fact, we've been very careful to try as far as possible to lock in interest rates.
Right.
Because we recognize that in a world where interest rates are rising, you face a lot of exposure from a very hefty interest bill as the major benchmark interest rates have gone up, whether it's LIBOR or SOFR or, there are a number of global benchmark interest rates on which floating rates are typically anchored. Interest rates have been rising, and were we exposed to rising interest rates, we would have had a dramatically increasing, were we fully exposed to increasing interest rates, we would have had a dramatically increased interest bill, and it would have been much, much more expensive for us to borrow. And so these are things that, formulating your economic policy in an environment where this is the global, in this global context. And then, of course, in the domestic context where you have a rapidly growing economy, and a rapidly growing economy does also, see inevitably bring some risk of overheating, and those have been spoken about already. One has to be extremely careful in crafting your policy stance in order to ensure that you manage and contain all of the risks, some of which are imported and some of which are domestic. And we have been very careful to do this, and I think we've done this with relative success in a very, very challenging global environment, and indeed a domestic environment that is certainly not without challenges. And so the statement, on the appropriateness of our fiscal and monetary policy stance,
Mix,
it might, to the untrained eye, it might look like just a passing statement, a casual statement. But beneath that statement is a careful analysis.
That's what you work for.
That absolutely.
That's what you work for. That's what finance ministers, that's what governments work for, right?
Absolutely. So, that's the bread and butter of what we do every day, to ensure that the global and domestic realities are understood, are monitored and understood, and that our policy positions are calibrated to respond to those realities.
One aspect of overheating is a tight labor market, which is a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's allowing wages to go up. On the other hand, it has some inflationary dimensions to it, but also there is a labor supply issue. Numbers have been thrown around 100,000 people we need to fill this gap. Our administration has said perhaps one way to address this is to increase the female participation rate, right? What's your take on it?
Sure. So here again, I'm glad that you raised that issue, Randy, because it's a very, very important issue. The Guyanese economy is growing rapidly. We've been growing on average in excess of 40% over the last 2 to 3 years. We're going to be growing in excess of 25% per annum over the next 3 to 4 years and possibly beyond. We're seeing new industries emerge, new companies established, new types of jobs created, new kinds of skills being demanded.
New sectors.
Complete new sectors, new skill types being demanded in the labor market. We are already seeing in some categories of work there is a shortage of suitably skilled labor. If you look at what's happening, for example, in heavy equipment operators, there's so much demand in mining and in industry and in warehousing and in construction for heavy equipment operators that there's a vast shortage. I know companies that say that they have equipment that is parked up because they don't have heavy equipment operators to operate them, to drive them. If you look at what's happening in construction, and particularly skilled construction work, and how wage rates have increased in construction for skilled and unskilled labor in construction, you get an understanding of how demand and supply are equating in this reality of today. Now, this is the reality in which we're operating, and this reality is going to continue for the foreseeable future, given the anticipated continued strong growth in the economy. And so we as a government recognize the importance of endeavoring to have an adequate supply of suitably skilled labor to achieve a twofold purpose. One, to ensure that on the demand side, industry and commerce have access to labor with suitable skills so that they can continue their productive activity. But on the other hand, to ensure that as many Guyanese people are able to take up the jobs that are now becoming available.
Correct.
And notwithstanding that in some sectoral areas and in some geographical areas, there is more demand for labor than there is supply, or in particular in certain categories. One of the things that we take particularly serious is addressing mismatches in the labor market.
Right.
And when I think of these mismatches, we think of two things. One, sectoral or skills-related mismatches. Because you might have demand and growing demand for a particular set of skills. You might have people who are looking for work, but they don't have those particular skills that are being demanded.
Yeah.
And so notwithstanding that you have a need for labor, and notwithstanding that you have people who are looking for work, the two don't marry because of the skills mismatch. So we have a heavy agenda, an aggressive agenda, to reduce skills mismatches in the labor market by investing heavily in technical and vocational training, to train as many people as possible in the relevant areas that will be demanded today and tomorrow.
Housing becomes important here, and let me say why. The jobs, a lot of the jobs are in Region 4 and Region 3.
Right.
So you've got people from the outer regions, and you know, more jobs are being generated with development in Region 2, in Region 5, 6, Region 10. So, but those who want to gravitate towards where the higher paying jobs are, when they come here, one, I think, legitimate complaint that you hear is about housing availability, housing, the rent.
Sure.
So is there a mix
Sure.
of
So there are two
fiscal
things.
and
Sure. So there are two
let me
things.
hear.
There are two things. One. So I was speaking of the skills mismatch.
Right.
Training people so that they have the skills that are being demanded today and tomorrow.
Correct.
So here I speak of things like the New Guyana Technical Training College that is being built in Port Morant,
Right.
which will house the National Oil and Gas Institute. Here I speak of the specialized training in areas like heavy equipment operators. Just a few weeks ago, I launched a series of heavy equipment operator training programs in Berbice, under which 220 heavy equipment operators will be trained. Here I speak of the investment in the technical and vocational institutes like the Georgetown Technical Institute, the Government Technical Institute in Georgetown, Linden, New Amsterdam, Upper Quarantine, and so on. training in areas such as welding, fabrication, machinists, and a number of the other specialized areas that are being demanded by oil and gas and construction and so on. But in addition to the issue of skills mismatches, you quite rightly point out to that second category of what I would call mismatches in the labor market, and that is geographical mismatches.
Correct.
So a lot of the jobs are being created typically at the mouth of the Demerara River. That's where the action really
Correct.
is, on both sides, West Demerara and East Bank
Across
Demerara.
sectors, from tourism to
It doesn't matter what.
heavy duty operators,
to restaurants, to hotels,
yeah,
to
yeah.
taxi drivers, to service providers, to accountants. The jobs are being created, to engineers.
Yeah.
The jobs are being created in the first instance on the two sides of the mouth of the Demerara River. That's where the
So Minister
action-
Kroll and Minister Rodriguez come in. The work they're doing now is centrally.
Well, I
important,
would say that we have a twofold approach
Yeah.
to this. One, to increase the housing stock,
correct? Right.
to make it easier for Guyanese families to become homeowners, and including giving them flexibility to move. So if you want to move to West Demerara, you can apply. You might not necessarily get a house lot in exactly
Yeah.
where you want to get it,
Yeah.
but increasing the housing stock in general, which not only makes it easier for you to own a home, but also increases potentially rentable properties.
Correct.
So, we give out homes. A lot of people will become homeowners. Some of them may build a small apartment on their ground floor, which they can rent out, and we welcome that. We welcome and encourage that. There's nothing wrong with that. If you have a 2-story home, you apply for your house lot, you build a 2-story home, you can put 2 small apartments on your ground floor, rent those out, whether it is to a local migrant worker, somebody coming from out of town to have a job locally, or indeed a student coming to Georgetown to study in Georgetown at the university or technical institute. We welcome that. That's good. And so one is, of course, the increase in the housing stock
Yeah.
and the impact that would have on availability and affordability of housing, both in the sale segment of the real estate market and indeed the rental segment of the real estate market. But in addition to that, we also have a studied position to geographically disperse the jobs as well.
Right. Correct.
So we are making concerted efforts to also create jobs outside of Georgetown and away from the mouth of the Demerara River.
Wales, Palmyra, Linden, Bartica,
absolutely.
Regina,
Absolutely.
Lethem.
Absolutely.
The projects are all over.
Absolutely.
Molson Creek, the bridge being built there.
Absolutely.
Right?
And in sectors that will also draw on segments of the labor market that have historically excluded themselves from the labor market. You mentioned young women.
Yes.
So if you go into the average call center, 80% of their employees are women.
Correct.
Now, I don't want to appear to be contributing to any gender stereotypes or anything like that, but the reality is that a lot of the construction and oil and gas jobs are still, unfortunately, perceived as boys' jobs.
Yes.
That's unfortunate, and we want that to change because we don't believe there's anything like a boy's job or a girl's job.
They're cultural institutions.
But the reality is that a job that's going to take you out on a rig for 6 weeks off, 2 weeks on, is more likely to attract male applicants than female applicants. Not least because, up to today, the women continue to be the anchor of the home in Guyanese homes, continue to be the primary caregiver to infant children. That's a social reality. And so we want to create jobs that will also be attractive to women, that will be equally and even more attractive to women. And so while a lot of what's going on in construction and in oil and gas might perhaps appeal more to male applicants, and like I emphasize that as a government we want that to change because we want those jobs to appeal equally to male and female applicants.
Sure.
In the meantime,
Yeah.
we're also working hard to create jobs that will be attractive to female applicants and will be more, conducive to their circumstances.
And we have good news because when you look at the results of CXC and CAPE and so on and so forth, it's half and half. Women are now increasingly entering fields that were thought to be the preserve of men in engineering and
absolutely.
economics and
Absolutely.
accounting, a wide range of.
And we welcome that. And
Yes.
so investments like in the call centers, in
Yeah.
the construction of the call center shells, we're building 2 in Berbice, 2 in Essequibo. We're partnering with a call center in Linden as well. Those are also initiatives aimed at creating jobs and creating jobs in areas where there is surplus labor force on the supply side, and
Yeah.
in particular, trying to attract more women into the workforce.
Right. Okay. I still on overheating, because I know you're concerned about it. The president the administration is concerned about it. Dutch disease. One of its expressions is exchange rate. Now, we have a fluctuation band basically of around 207 to 211, 215 thereabout. And that fluctuation band has been stable, which is what matters.
Sure.
It's the stability and the predictability and the trust in the currency. Market forces could readjust that on its own. And could you comment on that?
Sure. So, first of all, the Guyana dollar is a floating currency.
A managed float, though, right?
Well, we have a policy objective of maintaining stability.
Right. Okay.
And so where that stability were to be seen to be coming under threat, we would intervene to revert to a stable trajectory.
Right.
So we do have a policy objective of stability of the currency. And you are absolutely correct. In your prefatory remarks, you just correctly pointed out that it's the stability and predictability that really matter. You are absolutely correct about that. And that is the government position. Now, exchange rates are, amongst all of the economic variables, perhaps amongst the most misunderstood. So there are a lot of people who feel that 200 to 1 is good, but 50 to 1 would be even better. The reality is that an appreciating currency, while it might look attractive or appealing, will in fact undermine the competitiveness
Our exports.
of our exports.
In the non-oil sectors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have seen this around the world,
Correct.
where you have a rapid influx of foreign currency into the economy, the exchange rate appreciates, and every other output that is produced in the economy, in the non-oil economy, becomes uncompetitive to the rest of the world. You're unable to export anything because it becomes more expensive for international buyers to buy anything you're producing domestically. And so we have adopted very explicitly a position that we would like to preserve a stable exchange rate. And we monitor this very closely. We remain closely engaged with the private sector and with the banking sector. And we will all of our policy positions will remain aligned behind the preservation of a stable exchange rate, amongst other objectives, of course. But a stable exchange rate is certainly one of our economic
And
policy
it matters,
objectives.
coming from you, Minister, that's really important because it's a confidence in at least the medium-term trajectory of currency stability. That's
Absolutely.
really what matters to investors, to the general public. If we look at what's happening in Argentina and Venezuela with runaway inflation, people run to the shops so that the money is not of less value by the time they get there. I don't think we have that here whatsoever. But the question has been raised. I want to move to it's more like just something I've been thinking about that. Inert assets that people had, let's say their house or their house lot, and they have held them for a very long time. You will remember at one time people were just leaving their houses or giving it to neighbors, and now they're saying, wait a minute, I want it back, because the asset prices have really shot up. But is there an asset bubble, or is this based upon sound macroeconomic fundamentals?
I wouldn't I mean, first of all, let me say that we are operating in an open market environment, right? So
right.
prices
are asserting themselves.
prices are asserting themselves.
Yeah.
Prices are determined by current levels of demand, current
Yeah.
levels of supply. Now, you have indeed seen an appreciation in prices, particularly for certain categories of assets like real estate.
Yeah.
You correctly mentioned houses and land and so on. And I believe that what that reflects is the current state of expectations regarding the future in the market.
Which is different from hot money speculation.
Absolutely,
Right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you see this, in fact, in the geographical, if you were to disaggregate the market geographically, you'd see that what people are trying, what I get the sense that what the market is trying to do is to anticipate where future developments where the future hotspots for development will
Right.
be.
Right.
And the market is responding to that. And so the government, and we have been very open and transparent about our policy plans in terms of where major infrastructure. But to give you one example, we've said publicly, the Wales Development Authority, that's where the gas-fired power plant will be going. That's where the major industrial development will be going. That has automatically translated into revised expectations regarding asset values around.
And a devolution of asset value.
Absolutely.
Right? The spreading out of
absolutely.
opportunities, economic opportunities.
Absolutely. So whereas 20 years ago, assets in that area might have been considered to be
When Wales was closed down by APNU FC.
when Wales was closed down by APNU FC, those became wastelands.
Correct. People are abandoning their
That's
properties.
correct.
Now they're running back to claim it.
Absolutely. And you're seeing more and more of that across the country. And so I have great faith in the judgment of the actors in our market. I have great faith in the efficiency of the market. I believe that it will continue to evolve. Prices will continue to evolve as expectations get refined. And I don't know of a better mechanism to set prices than an open and free market.
We are nearing our time, and so I want to get back to where we started, and that is the PPP's focus, as always, but certainly now, on human development, and measures like the part-time job or returning funding for school children that APNU AFC took away. I just want to mention this, that government is really focused and is keeping a close eye, is monitoring what is happening out there with families, with working people. And I know you want to assure working people that the administration has their interests at heart. It's not only the macroeconomy.
No, absolutely. I'm going to say this, Randy, and I'm in fact glad that you are winding down the program. If we're winding down, I notice you watched the clock just now.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought us back to that point, because I have argued that there's a very interesting nexus between the economic policy choices that are made by a government and a government's perspective, and that government's perspective and that government's perspective. In fact, let me say that again. I've often said that there's a very tight nexus between the economic policy choices that are made by a government and that government's perspective of democracy and how democracy functions. Since we've come back to government, we have focused our energy on the things that matter most to people. Removing all of the punitive taxes that APNU put on the burden.
Hundreds of them.
Hundreds of taxes that they put on the backs and shoulders of the Guyanese people. Restoring the social benefits and transfers that APNU so callously took away from the people of Guyana, including the cash transfer for school children, including some of the employment benefits, like for example the 1 month bonus that was paid to the disciplined services,
Caused havoc in the indigenous communities.
including the restoration of the CSO program
Right.
to once again employ our young Amerindian brothers and sisters, restarting the sugar industry to resume some measure of employment in the sugar industry,
Part-time
is-
jobs.
establishing a part-time job program, etc. And the list goes on. I could list 100 things that we've been doing to reverse the callous and punitive measures implemented by the APNU AFC during their time in office. And this brings me to make the following point. When you are an adherent to competitive democracy as a model of governance, you understand that every 4 or 5 years in Guyana, every 5 years, you have to compete for votes. The People's Progressive Party every 5 years goes to the people of Guyana and competes for their votes. We make a sincere attempt to win their votes. Contrast a government that has no qualms. Contrast a government like the APNU AFC that had and has no qualms about taking away the jobs, putting sugar workers on the breadline,
7,000 people.
7,000 of them, and their families,
And their families.
and the indirect persons,
Yeah.
the tens of thousands
Yes,
of persons indirectly dependent. The APNU has no qualms. Up to now, they're opposed to any support provided to the sugar industry. Up to now, they oppose support given in the parliament, and they, if they had a chance, they would close down the sugar industry. Sending home Amerindian CSOs, taking away from the homes of every single member of the discipline service 1 month tax-free income,
That's heartless.
taking away from the homes of every single family that has a child going to school the cash grant that was being given to that child.
Unbelievable.
And you have to ask yourself, would a government that is cognizant of the need to go back to these very people and ask them for their vote, would a government that respects the paramountcy of the votes of the people of the country
Yeah.
inflict that kind of hardship on those very people? And when you ask yourself that question, it provides you with an important insight into the PNC's, the APNU's perspective and understanding of democracy. It is within their DNA not to respect democratic outcomes. It's within their DNA. They don't consider themselves as needing to win votes.
Which is why they don't worry about macroeconomic fundamentals,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Because
Why worry about policies that will inflict hardship on people when you don't need to win their
You'll
votes?
just take the election.
You just
Right?
steal the election.
Right.
You just install your man as the GCOM
Correct.
chairman, disregarding 18 nominees by the opposition leader. You plant your people within the GCOM. You put in place a machinery to steal the election. Why worry about economic policies? And
But this Ali
that goes to the
administration-
core, and that is what distinguishes the PPP from the APNU, AFC, PNC, whatever they call themselves now. That is what distinguishes those two political entities.
And the PPP will go back to the people with these policies. That they're confident that they're uplifting not only the economy, but the people.
Absolutely.
They're
Absolutely.
there are different dimensions of an economy and of a macroeconomic
Absolutely.
situation.
Absolutely.
So, Minister, when I was coming here, I was leaving the office of the president to come here. I ran into some staff, and they asked me to ask a question on their behalf. And it's a two-part question. They want to know what you're doing for them this Christmas, and what are you going to do for them in next year's budget.
Well, you know, I'm never one to spoil. I'm never one to spoil a surprise, Randy, and I don't intend to depart from that tradition. What you can certainly say to your colleagues and indeed to anybody that you encounter, this government is preoccupied, fully preoccupied with the interests of the people of Guyana. And that is what motivates us, that is what drives us, that is what determines all that we do. I don't want us to get too hung up about what specifically is going to be done next month or the month after.
A number,
so.
yeah.
I don't want to get, because what we as a government are doing, in terms of our policies, everything that we do is aimed at improving people's lives. Whether it is fixing a community road, fixing drainage,
Hospitals.
building new hospitals, building new schools, making it more affordable to own homes. Whatever we do is aimed at improving people's lives through one channel or another. And there are multiple channels through which well-being can be influenced.
True.
When you make home ownership more affordable, and you make new homes more readily available, and you make a whole new generation of Guyanese families become homeowners for the very first time, you are transforming the lives of an entire generation.
And building wealth, because homeownership is the best way to build long-term wealth.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. You have an asset. You now have young Guyanese families, people in their 20s, 30s, owning a property for the first time.
Which you can go to the bank.
You go to the bank, you can
Get
collateralize
credit.
that, you can borrow. That's
Yeah.
an asset that you
Start
can
a small business.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you set the basis for wealth creation.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that happening already. And we want it to happen many times over. We want every Guyanese family.
And that's the model even in the developed economies, where home ownership is really the surest way to building intergenerational wealth.
Absolutely.
Correct? Yeah.
And it brings you into the financial system. You become a borrower for the first time. You establish a track record with the bank. You're better able to access credit, not only because you have an asset, but because you have a track record of credit worthiness. Yeah. It brings you into the formal economic and financial system in a way that nothing else could.
And reorient people's, shall we say, mentality
Absolutely.
towards the relationship with the economy, right?
Absolutely.
So it's an interactive thing between individuals and economy and families and economy.
Absolutely.
It's not like you're over here and the economy is over there.
And we've promised 50,000 new house lots. We will exceed that. We've already done more than a half. That means another 50,000 Guyanese families or more who will own their own home. And Randy, I will tell you this. I came back to Guyana in 1993, and this was the very early days of the new PPP government. And of course, I grew up in Guyana too. I know the Guyana of the 70s and the 80s. As a young person, as a teenager, and young adult, it was inconceivable for me to think of owning my own home. That was not something that was even on my radar.
Right.
You had to be, to put it loosely, a rich person to own your own home.
Yeah.
Today, I'm filled with pride when I see young professionals in my ministry and working elsewhere in government or working in the private sector or running their own small business. I can't begin to tell you how proud I am when I see young Guyanese people owning their own home, and including, young women, single mothers. They have a job, they're earning their own, they've taken a loan from the bank, they've bought their own home or built their own. I can't begin to tell you how much pride that fills me with.
And it's all over the country.
And it's everywhere.
You don't have any regional
and
concentration.
I feel proud as a country that we are now in that place where young people, you're in your 20s, you complete your studies, you get a job, you apply for a house lot, you go to the bank, you take your loan, you buy your house, or you get your house lot and you build your house.
Roof over your head.
And you're able to do that. You can do that. That is achievable by
No.
the time you're 30 years old in Guyana. And that's a matter I feel proud at a national level, and I feel proud when I hear these stories. You know,
And we're seeing them. The thing about, I think one of the, if I may, is that you could actually see what used to be talked about before.
absolutely.
You got the back of LBI there, and it's astounding. You could drive 2-3 miles into the back,
That's correct.
and all of those houses that are being built there, they're going to be ordinary Guyanese families
That's correct.
that are going to go in there.
Absolutely.
And from the day they turn their key, right,
That's correct.
the dynamic of personal wealth accumulation
Absolutely.
would begin, correct?
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
And I think that's a good note for me, not only to thank you, but to also, I can't miss this opportunity to say, I think we ought to do this again.
Randy, it's been a great pleasure, and I'd be happy to come again.
Thank you so much, Minister.
Thank you very much.